Who's ready for a live review of the 2022 GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement, the most commonly used contract here in the state of Georgia, GAR Form F201. We are going to go through each one of the blanks to be completed in the contract and answer frequently asked questions. So a lot of information coming your way here. If you are watching this and you are a Solid Source agent, just as a reminder, we are here for you. We understand that every real estate transaction that you handle is going to be different, whether it's a single family property, maybe it's a condo, maybe it's a townhome. So every transaction is different. We understand that. So email us, call us. We're always happy to look at drafts of contracts as well. Now, let's take just a moment before we actually dive into the contract and talk about who has access to the GAR forms, because if you are a realtor with Solid Source Realty, you already have access to the GAR forms through your annual membership that you pay to your local association of realtors, typically around $425 a year, and you will have an NRDS number, a NERDS number. If you are not a realtor and you have purchased a license to use the GAR forms, that is how you would obtain access if you are not a realtor. You could simply visit forms.garealtor.com, around $254 a year at the moment, and you will receive a Forms Purchase ID number, an FPID number. You will enter this information into Settings and FMLS Remind Docs Plus, or whatever system you are using, to access the GAR contract forms. Contract forms are located in the MLS. You can also access them on the garealtor.com website, but when you pull forms in from the MLS, specifically FMLS, they will be editable forms, they will be smart forms, and you can also send them out for electronic signature. Now in Georgia, you may wonder, why do you have multiple contracts? Why are you saying that you prefer the GAR contract? Most brokers that you talk to and listing agents here in Georgia are going to prefer the GAR contract forms for a number of reasons. They are more user-friendly, they do more to protect the parties, and they're updated every year based on feedback from agents and also case law that happens, laws that change here in the state of Georgia. So GAR's approach to the contract is, it is a general agreement. It's an 8-page agreement with the blanks on pages 1, 7, and 8. So only 3 pages have blanks on them. And one of those 3 pages is a signature page. So GAR has made it super easy for us by condensing all of the blanks, most of the blanks, to that very first page. So we customize the agreement by filling in the blanks, by adding exhibits, and adding special stipulations. So that is how we customize the form. So general agreement does an awesome job of meeting the needs of most residential resale transactions. And the most common way that we customize it is by adding financing exhibits. Those financing exhibits in GAR, they include the appraisal contingency. So you'll notice on that conventional loan exhibit, there's going to be an appraisal contingency on the second page. If you are using an FHA or a VA exhibit, it's still going to be on the second page, but it's called a mandatory clause, and that mandatory clause is the appraisal contingency. It's a blanket appraisal contingency that runs the entire life of the contract. So most common way that the forms are customized is by attaching an exhibit or adding special stipulations. So if you are as excited as I am, we're going to go ahead and switch over to FMLS. We're going to pull up the contract. I'm going to show you where you can access the broker packages that Solid Source has created for you, just to make everything a little bit easier and keep everything in one place. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so I have simply logged into FMLS. Here on the home page, if you scroll under Products and you select Remine, that is going to take you to the Remine homepage. Now from the Remine homepage over on the left-hand side, you do want to go ahead and select Docs Plus, and that is going to take you to your Docs Plus dashboard. Now I'm going to have a little bit more access here on the broker level, but here's where we're going to simply create a new transaction. Now I know I mentioned just a moment ago about your NRDS number and your FPID number if you have purchased a license to use the GAR forms this year. that can be entered under settings. So that is where you are going to enter your NRDS number or your FPID number. Once you have done that, if you select create a transaction, you have the opportunity to simply fill in some contract basics here. And I do encourage everyone to play around with it, practice. Don't wait until you have a buyer or a seller. Go ahead and become familiar with the contracts. Now, if this was an FMLS listing, I could simply enter in the property address and it would help to populate that, or the MLS number. In our example today, we are going to say that this is a for sale by owner, and so we're not going to enter in any information there. And I'm just simply adding buyer and seller as the names just to get us started here. But the point is, once you've done that, once you have entered those basic transaction details, you will see this pop-up window here. Now, it automatically takes you to forms, but if you look over on the left, you will also see packages, and this is a very, very nice feature for brokers here in FMLS. Quickly though, under forms, you can search under the folder. For example, you can search individually for forms in the GAR folder. You can search by keyword or form number if you need to, and pull up every form with that number or that keyword in it. Because under packages, if you click on your company, you will notice both RE and GAR packages. We've got a package for buyer, listing, offer, referral. Maybe you're doing a referral and you don't remember what forms are needed for a referral. So we just kind of made everything a little bit easier by adding those forms here for you. Now, every transaction is different, and I'm going to be using the offer package today, so it's not possible always to include every possible exhibit or form, but this is going to be the most commonly used ones. It's going to have your cash exhibit, all of your financing exhibits. It's going to have that offer. So we are simply going to select the documents that we are going to be working with today. And another form that I'm going to point out too that you may have noticed is the disclosure to buyers when making competitive offers. This is a form that we, along with our in-house attorneys, created, and I'll pull that in so you can see it too. That just helps to set proper expectations, let's put it that way, for buyers. We understand that in the market that we are in right now, buyers are placing offers with shorter contingency periods, very short due diligence periods. In some cases, they have not even seen the property, which is never recommended, but this form just kind of goes over an array of examples and just kind of helps to set those expectations for the buyer. And just quickly, here's an example of that disclosure to buyers when making competitive offers that you have access to. You can simply send this to the party that you were working with. They are not required to sign it. If they want to sign it, if they want to initial it, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and do that. But we are working with the purchase and sale agreement today. Now, as we dive in, notice that we pulled these contracts in from the system. We pulled these contracts in from the system, but we could upload them if we had a document on our desktop. Maybe it's a disclosure and we just simply want to get it into our contract package. We could simply upload it. Every transaction in FMLS has its own unique email. So you could also email documents to this specific folder. Maybe it's a builder contract. For whatever reason, the documents are in a PDF form, and instead of uploading them, you want to actually email them here, you can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and select the purchase and sale agreement. Now, what you will notice in FMLS, and here I'm going to zoom in to make this easier for everyone, you will notice that there are smart forms, such as the one we're playing with today, and there are also PDFs. PDF, you can simply move over the text boxes, the dates, the signatures, and initial fields as you need to. You can still work with the PDF and set it up, edit it, and send it out for signature, but the smart form is definitely going to be much, much easier. So here we are. So we are face to face with the 8-page GAR purchase and sale agreement, and we're on the very first page where a majority of the blanks to be completed are going to be. And we're starting with the offer date. This is simply going to be the date the offer is being made. In most cases, the same date the buyer is going to sign it, and we're going to send it to the other party. This is not a date in general to be overly concerned about because it is, for the most part, just a reference date. There are no time frames that are measured from the offer date other than the time frame for acceptance that we'll also talk about here in just a few moments. But GAR then immediately moves on to key terms and conditions. And in this section here, we have two options or two places where we identify the property. In section A, we identify the commonly known mailing address, and in section B, we identify the legal description to the property or a key where a party could find the complete metes and bounds legal description for property here in Georgia. So we're simply going to manually enter in an address today, and I will simply use the office address here just to keep everything simple. Again, this is just a hypothetical transaction, but and when it comes to the actual legal description of the property, that is most oftentimes going to be found within the tax records. Within Realist, there will be a last market and sales history that will include the most recent deed book and the page number. If we have a copy of the deed, perhaps Weissman is the closing attorney, and you have emailed Sherry Gill at Weissman and she was able to provide back a copy of that deed, go ahead and attach that deed as an exhibit to the contract. The deed does a lot of great things for us. Not only will it include that full metes and bounds legal description for real property here in Georgia, it also helps to confirm the parties who have interest, who the owners actually are to the property. Quickly, everyone, the MLS number, not required. Tax parcel ID number, not required, but most oftentimes we are going to have that, and we can simply enter that in from the tax records. If it were a condominium, we would need to also attach F204. It's simply just an exhibit that discloses that the property is an air lot. It's a condominium. If it's a townhome, nothing additional, nothing special is going to be needed. A townhome is going to have, it's an attached property, yes, but it is still property that the owner owns from the ground all the way to the heavens that we learned in our pre-license course. So nothing special would be needed for a true townhome. Some townhomes are deeded as condos. Some of you know that. Some of you have ran into that. That we should be able to tell that by looking at the tax records. Let's say that hypothetically we do have the deed book and page number, and I'm simply going to fill in a hypothetical number for our purposes today. If you are going to use the deed book and the page number from the Realist tax records, a good idea to cross-reference that with the tax assessor's office just to make sure, because that link to the tax information is only going to be as good as the listing agent, the information that they entered in, just as a disclaimer. And in section 4, don't typically recommend this here because usually we do not know the plat book and the page number, and so simply entering in a lot or a unit number or a phase, that's not going to be enough. We would at least want to have the plat book and the page number there as well. So number 4, not commonly used and not one that I'm usually going to recommend. Usually number 3 or number 1 are going to be our go-tos. Okay, so moving along to number 2 here, which is purchase price of the property. Pretty simple. This is going to be the price the buyer is offering to purchase the property for. Section 3, closing costs. This is the seller's contribution toward the buyer's closing costs. And those of you making offers or working transactions in the last year or so, few years, know that this is the most common this is the most common number that we see. There's no right or wrong with this. Usually a lender is going to have a cap as to how much they will allow a seller to contribute toward a buyer's closing costs. That may be 3% in a lot of cases. So if you are going to ask for closing costs, just a good habit to consult with the lender. So if that amount is an excessive amount, the excess would remain with the seller. And that's in some of the boilerplate. That's what we call the language in the other pages. I know that we say the GAR contract is 8 pages with blanks on 3. Those other 6 pages, everyone, is really important. And I do encourage everyone to to take the time to read those, because a lot of remedies for issues that come up in transactions are going to be included there, and further details about all of the sections that we fill in on the first page of the contract. Those paragraphs go into detail for those sections as well. Possession and closing, we're moving right along. Typically, we want possession to be at the closing. Most closings are going to take about 45 days to actually occur. I tend to stay away from Mondays, tend to stay away from Fridays, because if there are any issues on a Friday, it may be Monday before we can actually close. So picking another day during the week, Tuesday through Thursday, is generally considered a good idea. We understand that there are some situations where a buyer does need to move in early, or a seller stay in a property after the closing. A buyer moving in before closing is definitely riskier, and the most protection we can offer a party if they do choose to go that route is to include a temporary occupancy agreement. Now, GAR has one for the buyer and also one for the seller, so we would want to attach that, include the number of days and the actual time that the property would be available if we are going the temporary occupancy route. So we're also going to enter in a closing attorney. Weissman is our preferred closing attorney. They have locations all across the state of Georgia. Check them out, weissman.law, to see all of the locations if you are not familiar. You can certainly reference the location in parentheses and also the phone number. Section number 6 is going to be the earnest money holder. So if the closing attorney is the holder, we do need to also include F510 and 511. F510 would be attached and 511 would be signed by the attorney. And it's actually pretty popular for the closing attorneys to serve as the holder. Here at Solid Source, we are happy to hold earnest money. It would just need to be named to Solid Source Realty. So we do have two public-facing real estate companies, Realty and Realty GA. So even if you are licensed with Realty GA and you want Solid Source to hold that earnest money, you do want to name Solid Source Realty as the holder. ACH is very popular. It's not a wire. Oftentimes, ACH is used as a synonym for a wire, but it's not. It's actually more similar to an electronic check. It is an electronic payment. And weissmanem.com, weissmanem.com, if Weissman's the holder and buyer wishes to pay by ACH. If Solid Source Realty is the holder and buyer wants to remit funds by ACH, solidsourcem.com, very popular. Important to simply select the form of the earnest money that's going to be remitted, and also the amount and when the funds are due. Section A, or option A, I almost never recommend, because if this option is selected, that means the earnest money is already with the holder. They should already have it, and that's just usually not the case. So, and most buyers aren't too happy when they've remitted funds for an offer that's not accepted. They want those funds to be available for other offers that are accepted, right? So, and when it comes to earnest money, typically 1 to 2% of the offer price is what's customary, and within 2 to 3 days from the binding date. Now, there's no set rule. Earnest money, not legally required. That's a common question we receive. It's not required, but it's heavily customary, and I cannot imagine a seller, definitely in a seller's market, accepting an offer without earnest money. And one of the reasons for that is, you all may remember, if you've been in the business for a couple of years, that GAR made a change to the GAR contract a few years ago, and a seller's sole remedy, if a buyer defaults, is the collection of the earnest money. So it's so important to always confirm that that earnest money has been turned in. If a buyer has a short due diligence period, I know we're moving along here to Section 8, and let's say the buyer has 3 days for due diligence, and the earnest money is not due until 5 days. Well, that may not be the way that the seller wants to go. You probably want that earnest money turned in pretty quickly, especially when the due diligence period is going to be brief. And speaking of the due diligence period, that is the opportunity for a buyer. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more for everyone. That is the opportunity for a buyer to terminate for any reason if they are not happy with the results of a home inspection, a termite inspection. Maybe they confirmed with the HOA fees. Maybe they can't rent in the community and they thought they could. This is the opportunity to terminate the contract unilaterally without penalty. Outside of the due diligence period, a buyer may have a financing or an appraisal contingency, but their opportunity to simply change their mind won't be there anymore. Never recommend zero due diligence. If that is the only way to go, GAR does have another option, and that is to attach a property sold with right to request repairs exhibit, which give the buyer an opportunity to still have an inspection and to try to negotiate repairs if there are issues that are discovered. That's a very confusing form for most agents and most brokers, so we don't typically recommend that form, but you can absolutely argue that it's better to have that attached if there's no due diligence. But a short due diligence is definitely worth the negotiation, even if you have to pay for it, right? So, common question, what's the difference between earnest money and option money? One big difference is option money is non-refundable to the buyer. Let me say that again. Option money is not refundable to the buyer. It's paid to the seller, and it may or may not go toward their purchase. We would love for it to. I absolutely recommend selecting that it shall. But if the buyer chooses to terminate within their due diligence period, they do not get the option money back. They're literally paying for the option of terminating during the due diligence period. What about option money with no due diligence period? Absolutely do not recommend it. I do receive that question from time to time. That is absolutely not what the option money is intended for. If you are paying option money, at least get a day or a few days of due diligence there. But in general, it is not common for buyers to pay option money to a seller, as it is in some other states. It's just not that common in Georgia, even in a very tough seller's market. So if possible, I would recommend staying away from the option money, but everything is negotiable. Okay, so moving down to lead-based paint. If the property was built prior to 1978, it would be extremely important to obtain from the seller a completed seller's lead-based paint exhibit. It would be important for the buyer to complete their portion of the lead-based paint exhibit, and that would need to be attached to the offer. Don't attach it to the offer for it to be completed by a party later. Don't reference in special stipulations that it will be completed later. We need that completed up front if the property or any portion of the property was built before 1978 in compliance with the EPA. Now in section number 10 here, we're talking about brokerage relationships. So we're going to identify the brokers involved in the deal and simply reference their relationship to the party they are working with. So if we are working with the buyer and we are with Solid Source Realty, and we have an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement or a buyer brokerage engagement agreement, we would be able to select one. The buyer would be a client. Now, if we don't have a signed buyer brokerage agreement, the buyer by default is a customer. Doesn't matter if they're a friend, a family member, a past client. If we don't have a live brokerage engagement, they are merely a customer. And we're so limited as to what we can do for customers. We can advise clients based on our experience and our expertise. We are not able to do that technically for customers because of the Brokerage Relationships and Real Estate Transactions Act, BRETA. So in most cases, buyers do want that client relationship when they understand the difference. And if you find it difficult to explain the difference or just want a little cheat sheet, GAR has a form called the ABCs of Agency, and that is a wonderful form for explaining brokerage relationships for yourself or for parties that you're working with. So just keep that in mind. Quickly, we will never select 3 because Solid Source does not offer dual agency, which would be the same agent on both sides of the deal, having a client relationship with both parties, a buyer brokerage with the buyer and a listing agreement with the seller. What if it's your listing and a buyer comes to you unrepresented, but they want you to work with them? You can as a customer. You just need to explain to them that you are representing the seller. The seller is your client. You're happy to work with them as a customer. Go ahead and give them the ABCs of agency. they will make a decision if they want to move forward working with you or if they choose to obtain their own representation in that deal. And designated agency, that is allowed, and that is when it's the same brokerage company on both sides of the deal. We do a number of deals every year, and it's really not that common for even us to have designated agency because it's the exact same real estate company on both sides. Realty and Realty, or Realty GA and Realty GA, and oftentimes there's a mix match there. So it would need to be the same company on both sides, and both agents, there'd be two different agents, but both agents would have a client relationship with the party that they're working with. Material relationship disclosure. Perhaps you as the buyer hold a Georgia real estate license. Perhaps the seller is a former client. There's a reason that you need to disclose a material relationship. 10C is definitely going to be the place to do it. And 11, time limit. Time limit's not required. It's generally considered a good idea, a reasonable time limit, 2 to 3 days from the offer date. Consider if the offer is being made on a weekend or a holiday, that is definitely going to come into play. Or let's just say that the buyer has called for highest and best offers by Friday at 5 o'clock, and 2 or 3 days from today would be before then. So we just want to keep an open mind, so to speak, when we're selecting that time limit of offer. Take everything into consideration. If you don't list a time limit and the buyer wants to start making offers on other properties or is accepted, an accepted contract comes in on another property, then you do want to go ahead and withdraw this offer. And GAR makes everything so easy for us. GAR has a notice to withdraw offer or counter offer form that may be used to do that. So that completes our first page of the GAR purchase and sale agreement. That's a lot of information coming your way. Now we're going to fast forward to page 7 of 8, which is exhibits and special stipulations. So when we are on page 7, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here. This is where we want to reference all exhibits that are going to be attached to the contract. As we mentioned earlier, your financing exhibits are going to be the most popular exhibits to attach. Reference those alphabetically. Amendments go in numbers and exhibits go with alphabet, A, B, C, D, and so forth. Everything needs to be in writing and contained within the contract. We never want to rely on verbal four corners of the contract. If there is a contingency on the buyer obtaining a loan, unless they are knowingly and willingly waiving that, then you would absolutely want to have that contingency exhibit attached. Now, special stipulations. Special stipulations trump everything else, which is why we want to be so careful with those. And the Georgia Association of Realtors has limited the amount of space that we have this year for special stipulations. So if we have a number of stips, we probably are going to need to attach that additional page. Now, you can add a clause or create a new one. Create new means you're writing your own, which don't generally recommend. Keep in mind we have some attorneys on staff here at Solid Source, and we're always happy to look at drafts of special stipulations as well. But before we ever write our own, I still look at what the Georgia Association of Realtors or what Solid Source already has available for us, because perhaps you're looking for an escalation clause, an appraisal gap clause, super popular right now. Maybe you want all of your time frames to end at 5 p.m. on the last day. We do have a special stipulation here that does that, because otherwise our time frames all end when? At 11:59 p.m. on the very last day. So that is a common question. So if we want to add one, we simply select it and can select done, and it's going to go ahead and add that to our contract. Now, special stipulations again do prevail over all other terms contained in the contract or attached, except when it comes to the amendatory clause that is on the FHA or the VA exhibits. You cannot override the blanket appraisal contingency that FHA and VA require. So just understand that, especially if you are considering that appraisal gap clause. And on the very last page of the GAR contract, this is where the buyers will have their information included, their printed name, their signatures. I do not usually include contact information for the parties unless they are unrepresented, because notice to an agent, notice to a broker is deemed notice to the party they are representing when there is a client relationship. That information's in the body of the contract. So, but if it's just a customer, notice to the agent is not. So customer, unrepresented, I would include their information. There's no right or wrong. If you are representing a party and you prefer to include their contact information, go ahead and do that. So additionally, we want to always ensure the name and the license number of the brokers and the name and the license number of the agent is included on the contract. And then the very last item that will be filled in on the contract is the binding agreement date. Now, I cannot fill this date in here, and you won't be able to fill it in either until the document is actually complete, until you've sent it out for signatures and it's been signed by everybody and it's back here in Docs Plus. Then it will let a party click and fill in the binding agreement date. And the binding date is truly the date that the party who made the last offer or the counter offer receives notice that the contract has been accepted without any changes. And it's the date that they receive it. And if that's by email, it's deemed received just as soon as it's emailed to the party. So let's just say we send this offer over to the seller. The seller signs it and they send it back over to us, but it was in my email box last night at 11 p.m., but I didn't see it until this morning. Technically, yesterday was the binding agreement date. Now, if that binding agreement date has been filled in wrong, the parties need to move very, very quickly. There is a remedy set forth here in the GAR contract for that, but time is absolutely of the essence if the binding agreement date is wrong, unless the parties are willing to accept it based on what has been filled in. Let's just take a look very quickly here at our PowerPoint when it comes to measuring time frames. Quick example, if the binding agreement date is January the 1st and the earnest money is due within 3 days, when are the funds due? So January 3rd, 4th, or 5th. Now, the funds would be due on January the 4th because that would be the 3rd day. The 1st would be considered day 0 for counting purposes. Day 1 would be the 2nd, day 2 the 3rd, and the 3rd day, the date that they're due by, would be January the 4th, and the buyer would have through 11:59 p.m. Thank you for watching. We appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, or comment, and we will keep bringing this type of content your way.